Nigerian writer Chimamanda Adichie reminds us that the single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. My name is Rosalie Uyola, and I am here to tell one story. I created this presentation using primary and secondary sources to provide a historical context for today's protests by walking you through the co-development of enslavement and policing, the creation and destruction of Black Wall Street, Jim Crow laws, the New Deal's Federal Housing Administration, COVID-19, and Juneteenth. Dr. King famously said that a riot is the language of the unheard. In his 1960 speech, The Other America, Dr. King explained that racism is evil because its ultimate logic is genocide. While many Americans today cherry-pick Dr. King's words to condemn direct action, it is important for us to remember that the man who has become synonymous with nonviolence in our cultural imagination was deeply resented for his beliefs during his lifetime. According to a 1966 Gallup poll, 2/3 of Americans had an unfavorable view of Dr. King. This image is of a protester carrying a U.S. flag upside down, a sign of distress, next to a burning building, and it was taken by Julio Cortez on Friday, May 29, 2020, in Minneapolis. The person holding the flag is unrecognizable. It could be any person of any age, race, or gender. It could even be you or me. While today's protests against police brutality are part of a long tradition within Black liberation, I think it's important for us to understand the facts of the case for both George Floyd and Brianna Taylor, whose deaths most immediately precipitated these protests. On May 25th, George Floyd, a 46-year-old Black man, died in Minneapolis, Minnesota, after a white police officer, Derek Chauvin, knelt on his neck for almost 9 minutes. The arrest came after a store clerk called the police, alleging that Floyd paid with a counterfeit $20 bill. George Floyd was handcuffed and lying face down on the street when he was telling the officers that he couldn't breathe. "Mama, Mama," George called out in his final moments. George's mother had died 2 years prior. He used his mama as a sacred invocation. George Floyd and Derek Chauvin knew each other as they worked together at a local nightclub. Another important person in the story is Darnella Frazier, a 17-year-old Black girl who filmed George Floyd's killing with her cell phone, all in a single shot for 10 minutes. Without her brave action, we may have not known about this murder. Darnella has publicly spoken out about being bullied on social media. Brianna Taylor, a 26-year-old Black woman and an award-winning EMT, was killed in her bed when police entered her home with a no-knock warrant, blindly firing 40 shots into the apartment. Her boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, called 911 and returned fire, trying to protect his family from intruders and exercising his Second Amendment right. Walker had a license to carry. The state of Kentucky uses the Castle Doctrine with a stand your ground law, which states, quote, "Any person who uses a gun in self-defense has immunity from criminal and civil law," end quote. Stand your ground was the defense George Zimmerman used after he killed Trayvon Martin. And yet, Kenneth Walker was arrested and faced charges of first-degree assault and attempted murder of a police officer. Here are just a few names of Black Americans who were killed by police since the death of Eric Garner in 2014. Many names are missing, especially of Black transgender and gender nonconforming people, like Tony McDade, a Black trans man who was shot and killed by police in Tallahassee, Florida, just last week. According to the website Mapping Police Violence, 1,945 Black Americans have been killed by police from January 2013 to December 2019. For transparency, I will share my thesis for this presentation. The reason why so many people destroy private property in response to racialized violence is because police, as an institution, were created to enforce enslavement and to protect private property. I think it's also important for us to note that while I'm speaking about the institution of policing, I am not speaking about individual officers, many of whom, like my stepfather, never committed racialized acts of violence. However, we must also acknowledge the meaning of the thin blue line. Individual officers take an unofficial loyalty oath of silence within departments to protect one another. Capitalism was built on centuries of generational enslavement that was propagated by sexual violence, and today's protesters are destroying private property to demonstrate the hypocrisy of people caring more about objects than about state-sanctioned murder of its own citizens. To read more about how capitalism is rooted in enslavement, I recommend the New York Times 1619 Project, which recently won the Pulitzer Prize. Before we discuss how police departments evolved on American soil, it is important to understand that many of the people who were arrested for looting during the current protests are white supremacists. According to the Anti-Defamation League, the term is used to refer to a variety of groups and individuals whose white supremacy centers around or originated from the struggle to deny equal rights to Black Americans. Ku Klux Klan groups are the most common types of traditional white supremacists, but the movement also includes others, such as the Council of Conservative Citizens, the League of the South, and others. Department of Safety Commissioner John Harrington said arrests made in Twin Cities Friday night were of people linked to white supremacist groups and organized crime. Although this may be surprising to many, white supremacist groups have been infiltrating law enforcement agencies around the country for decades. In their 2006 bulletin, the FBI detailed the threat of white nationalists and skinheads infiltrating police in order to disrupt investigations against fellow members and recruit other supremacists. The bulletin was released during a period of scandal for many law enforcement agencies throughout our country. In Los Angeles, a U.S. District Court judge found in 1991 that members of a local sheriff's department had formed a neo-Nazi gang and habitually terrorized Black and Latinx residents. In Cleveland, officials found that a number of police officers had scrawled racist or Nazi graffiti throughout their department locker rooms. In Texas, 2 police officers were fired when it was discovered that they were Klansmen. One of them said that he tried to boost the organization's membership by giving an application to a fellow officer he thought shared his, quote, white, Christian, heterosexual values, end quote. A classified FBI counterterrorism policy guide from April 2015, obtained by The Intercept, notes that domestic terrorism investigations focused on militia extremists, white supremacist extremists, and sovereign citizen extremists, who often identified active links to law enforcement officers. We see the same behavior in Facebook groups and online forums. In Chicago, John Birch, a police detective and KKK member, was fired and eventually prosecuted in 2008 over charges relating to the torture of at least 120 Black men during his decades-long career. Birch notoriously referred to an electric shock device he used during interrogations as, quote, N-word box, end quote. In 2012, 15-year-old Bobby Moore was fatally shot by Josh Hastings, a police officer in Little Rock who attended KKK meetings and boasted about body slamming a homeless Black woman to the ground who was in need of medical help. Systemic racism is so pervasive that Black police officers are now crossing the thin blue line to speak up. In The Second Coming of the KKK, historian Linda Gordon reveals that the Ku Klux Klan, a terrorist organization, often not in secret, was a mass movement claiming from 3 million to 6 million members across our country. In fact, the strongest groups were north of the Mason-Dixon line. The Klan counted amongst its members 11 governors, 45 members of Congress, and hundreds of local government officials. In the 1920s, many Klansmen entered courts as judges and enlisted as police officers. And while many Americans believed that law enforcement officers had been protecting the nation since its birth, primary sources reveal that the economics that drove the creation of police forces were centered on the preservation of enslavement and the protection of private property. The phrase "to protect and to serve" is not an oath that comes from the founding of the institution. Rather, it was a winning contest entry submitted to the Los Angeles Police Department. Policing in the United States is rooted in black codes and pig laws, which followed Reconstruction. These were broad vagrancy laws which allowed local police to arrest free black people for minor infractions and commit them to involuntary labor. Notice how these laws control the movement of black bodies. For example, walking next to a railroad while being black was illegal, riding a horse while being black was illegal, leaving a job without completing it regardless of pay or not was illegal, seeking a job without the permission of one's old boss or master was illegal, not having a job at all was illegal, loitering while being was illegal, and testifying against a white person, no matter the crime, was also illegal. Black codes and pig laws, all enforced by police, re-enslaved thousands of free black Americans. This primary source photograph shows alleged convicts who were leased to harvest timber in Florida in 1915. Agreements between correctional institutions and private corporations such as lumber companies and turpentine manufacturers enabled companies to use convict labor to greatly reduce labor costs in states that already had very low labor costs. Black Americans were arrested for minor, and often artificial, offenses, and then rented out to landowners, construction companies, or lumber companies in exchange for kickbacks, in what constituted a modern form of peonage, which was legally outlawed by Congress in 1867. After the Civil War, 4 million formerly enslaved people were looking for social equity and economic opportunity. The Supreme Court declared the Civil Rights Act of 1875 unconstitutional in 1883. The court also said Congress lacked the constitutional authority under the 14th Amendment to grant equal protection under the law to Black people, stating that only states and local governments could do that. After the Supreme Court ruled against the Civil Rights Act of 1875, every single Southern state redrafted its constitution. This primary source comes to us from the National Law Enforcement Museum. After the Civil War, police departments carried over aspects of slave patrols, including systemic surveillance and enforcement of curfews. In 1906, O.W. Gurley, a wealthy Black American from Arkansas, moved to Tulsa and purchased over 40 acres of land that he made sure was only sold to other Black Americans. Gurley provided an opportunity for those migrating, quote, from the harsh oppression of Mississippi, end quote. As a result of segregation, a dollar circulated 36 to 100 times and remained in Greenwood almost a year before leaving. Even more impressive at the time, the state of Oklahoma only had 2 airports, and yet 6 Black families owned their own private planes. Greenwood's residents exalted the virtues of capitalism and pooled money to create their very own bank, which in turn supported entrepreneurship at an unprecedented scale. Black Wall Street was modern, majestic, sophisticated, and unapologetically Black. Tragically, it also became the site of one of the bloodiest and most horrendous acts of terrorism that the United States has ever experienced. As you can see in this image, residents were patriotic and built their own banks, hotels, cafes, clothiers, movie theaters, and contemporary homes. Greenwood residents even enjoyed many luxuries that their white neighbors did not, including indoor plumbing and a remarkable school system that educated Black children. Here we see a school marching band, the founders of One United Bank, and a beautiful Black couple dressed in their Sunday best. All of this would come crashing down on May 30th, 1921, when a 19-year-old Black boy, Dick Rowland, entered an elevator where a white 17-year-old girl, Sarah Page, was the operator. Rowland tripped on Page's shoe and brushed against her arm as he tried to maintain his balance. Sarah screamed, which led a white clerk on the first floor of the building to report the incident as rape and assault. The very next morning, the Tulsa Tribune's headline read, quote, "Nab Negro for attacking girl in elevator," end quote, and reported that an angry group of whites was gathering to lynch the man. In the early morning hours of June 1st, 1921, Greenwood was looted and burned by white rioters. Governor Robeson declared martial law, and National Guard troops arrived in Tulsa. Guardsmen and police imprisoned all Black Tulsans not already interned. Over 6,000 people were held at the convention hall and fairgrounds, some for as long as 8 days. Here are photographs of white looters and rioters who stole, damaged, and destroyed personal property in Black homes and businesses. According to the Tulsa Historical Society and Museum, some of these people were, quote, agents of government, end quote. They deliberately burned 1,256 homes, along with virtually every other structure, including churches, schools, businesses, even a hospital and library. Despite duties to preserve order and to protect property, no government at any level offered resistance or help to the Black residents. Through eyewitness accounts, we know that violence was so personal that an elderly Black couple was killed by white vigilantes as they knelt in their bedroom to pray. Much of this history comes to us from B.C. Franklin, the father of famed historian John Hope Franklin. By today's estimates, the dreadful and murderous 16 hours caused more than $30 million in damages. The residents of Greenwood were blamed for the death and destruction, and the government made it nearly impossible to rebuild. Black Tulsans, many of whom had just served their country in World War I, were blamed for the destruction. Many were also members of the Industrial Workers of the World Union. Please note in this primary source that Black men were also found guilty of vagrancy laws. The Jim Crow system was upheld by local government officials and reinforced by acts of terror. It was a formal, codified system of racial apartheid that lasted in our country for over 75 years. According to an interview published in Harper's Magazine, one of Richard Nixon's top advisors and a key figure in the Watergate scandal said the war on drugs was created as a political tool to fight Blacks and hippies. Quote, "You want to know what this was really about?" he asked with the bluntness of a man whose public disgrace and a stretch in federal prison had little left to protect. Quote, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we could make it illegal to be either against the war or to be Black, but by getting the public to associate the white hippies with marijuana and Black people with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." End quote. From the 1930s through the 1960s, Black people across our country were largely cut out of the legitimate home mortgage market. In 1934, Congress created the Federal Housing Administration. The FHA insured private mortgages, causing a drop in interest rates and a decline in the size of the down payment required to buy a home. Redlining, or a way that FHA signaled which neighborhoods were considered to be desirable for FHA-backed loans, spread to the entire mortgage industry. This is a red line map of New York City. Notice that predominantly Black and Latinx neighborhoods are the ones that are categorized as hazardous or definitely declining. This is a FHA red line map of New Orleans. And this is a red line map of Chicago. By 1962, 85% of Black homeowners in Chicago lived in contract homes. These numbers are comparable to cities all across the country. To purchase a home on contract meant to enter a private deal with the home seller. Oftentimes, the sellers would bundle special deals, for example, including utilities or ongoing home repair, for housing that was usually in poorer shape than housing afforded to white families. The moment that a Black family was late on their payments or it defaulted at all, the home would immediately be taken away and resold to another family. They were not able to keep any of the equity. And so, in a sense, this became a very profitable practice. In Race for Profit, Dr. Brianna Taylor of Princeton University shows how exploitative real estate practices continued well after housing discrimination was banned by law. The same racist structures and individuals remained intact after redlining's end. New policies, meant to encourage low-income home ownership, created new methods to exploit Black families. The federal government guaranteed urban mortgages in an attempt to overcome resistance to lending to Black buyers, as if unprofitability rather than racism was the cause of housing segregation. Bankers, investors, and real estate agents took advantage of the perverse incentives targeting Black women, many of whom were heads of household, thinking that they would be the ones least likely to keep up with their home payments and to slip into foreclosure. They were right, and hence they were able to multiply their profits. Today, redlined FHA maps reflect yet another inequality. Black Americans, isolated in geographic areas that suffered lower levels of investment than their white counterparts, are dying from COVID-19 at more than double the rate than any other race or ethnicity. Despite representing a smaller share of a city or state's population, Black Americans share the highest percentages of COVID-19 deaths. Notice how in these New York City maps, people of color are overly represented in rent-burdened households. They also make up the majority of service workers. And just as Black citizens are 3 times more likely to be killed by police than their white counterparts, they are also more than twice as likely to die from COVID-19. This image was taken at a New York City protest against police brutality. Quoting Andre 3000, the sign encapsulates the feeling of Black Lives Matter supporters. Quote, "Across cultures, darker people suffer most. Why?" End quote. As we have seen over the past 2 weeks, many Americans are facing an impossible choice: to protest the deaths of George Floyd, Brianna Taylor, and many others in the streets, and hence exposing themselves and their children and elders to a respiratory global pandemic, or to remain silent in the face of state-sanctioned murder. Peaceful protests for Black Lives Matter have been met with police brutality, while protests against social distancing, just 1 month prior, by heavily armed white men on the steps of a government building, were not. This dichotomy is reflected by a president's tweets. For heavily armed white protesters, he tells the governor of Michigan to, quote, "Give a little. These are very good people. Make a deal." In response to Black Lives Matter protests, Mr. Trump calls participants thugs and suggests using the military against its own citizens. Interestingly, the phrase, quote, "when the looting starts, the shooting starts," end quote, has been traced back to the Civil War and was also used by Bull Connor and others who violently opposed the civil rights movement. Here we have two images of Black women protesters. The image on the left-hand side has been taken several years ago. This child represents someone who lost a parent due to police violence. On the right-hand side, a Black woman protester shares the very heart of the dilemma that many of us are facing. How do we move forward if we live in a world where trained police officers can panic and act on impulse, suggesting that their fear of a Black person, even if that person is unarmed or is a child, is enough for them to act with violence and with force, and yet untrained civilians must remain calm with a gun in their face? And yet, there is hope. Many people have come together across racial lines, age demographics, and all across the world in order to support one another against police brutality. Minneapolis bus drivers are refusing to help police transport peaceful protesters to jail. Here we see an image of Amish and Mennonite groups joining George Floyd protests and singing gospel songs. Interestingly, we're at a moment of great change where Minneapolis passed a school board vote to terminate its contract with police. Similar contracts are being reconsidered in places all across the country, including New York. And there's a large movement growing that's suggesting that police departments should be slightly defunded, with that money being shifted to support communities with healthcare, education, and affordable housing. Here we have images on the left-hand side of people protesting in Europe, and the image on the right-hand side was shared by friends in Italy. On this eve of Juneteenth, it's important to remember that emancipation and freedom weren't the same thing for Black Americans. It was on June 19th that General Order Number 3 was read. Quote, "The people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with the proclamation from the executives of the United States, all slaves are free." It's important to note that this proclamation was not read to local people until the people who own them were able to reap the benefits of free labor for yet another harvest. And so now, this year, let's remember Juneteenth, a holiday that doesn't mark a document, a battle, a birthday, or a national tragedy, but very much reflects the fundamental promise of America being completely realized, democracy for all. And it's important for us to remember that when one is neutral in situations of injustice, they have chosen the side of the oppressor. Thank you for your time.